Could you all please give us an introduction to the refugee crisis abroad and your experience of its impact here in Austin? We can start with you, Rebecca.
I feel like I would like to defer to the refugee services in Texas who is doing that work.
Okay, so some of you may be aware, it's been mentioned several times in the news recently because of all of the stuff that's been going on. But the United States government, specifically the president, sets a quota each year for the number of refugees that the United States is going to accept for resettlement. And within that quota, there are smaller quotas of which parts of the world or which countries that those refugees are going to come from as well. In the past, for a long time, the number's been at about 70,000 and has pretty much stayed there. And then the talk in the news that some of you may have seen is that they want to raise the number to 75,000 or potentially 85,000. The Secretary of State, Kerry, has been promoting 100,000 within the next couple of years. So those numbers affect our organization, right? Because you can almost think of our organization as almost kind of like contractors for the government in a way, right? So like the government says we're going to admit, X many number of refugees, and then they rely on organizations like ours to resettle those refugees. And they provide us with grants and different kinds of funding. We get grants from the federal government, from the state government, and from other different sources as well to actually carry out that resettlement.
So something that I think is really important to note is that right now the refugee crisis is going to have a delayed effect on Austin, of course. So the application process, all these things, we're probably not going to see Syrian refugees immediately, and we upped the quota, but when Iraqi refugees were coming into the US, today we see the demographics of Austin, and Iraqis are a huge portion of that, and that's something that was over time. So I think it's really important to note that, this crisis in Europe is going to affect us, but not right away.
For numbers and the US quota, it was actually before 9/11 happened. The U.S. resettled over 100, it was well over 100,000 refugees. And it had been consistent until 9/11. And then the refugee services all throughout the U.S., they shut down because of 9/11. And since then, it's been struggling to climb back up. And we're at 70,000 for this past fiscal year. Thankfully, we're pushing and making big jumps, trying to get 85,000 for this next year, maybe 100,000 in the next 2 years. Like Rebecca said, it's extremely hard for a refugee in a refugee camp in Malaysia or Jordan, somewhere else. The process trying to get over here is like winning the lottery, basically. I think about 1% of all refugees in those camps are actually resettled to other countries. So
there's a statistic when I go to speak to a lot of congregations or other community groups who were trying to get more involved. I give them the statistics from the UNHCR, which is for 2014 it was 19.5 million refugees, and only about 1%, actually maybe a little bit less than 1% of those are ever actually resettled in a third country. And kind of tagging on your question, the reason why raising those quotas is so important is because what we're seeing that's happening in Europe right now with all of those Syrians and Afghanis and Iraqis and Eritreans and other people who are making that extremely dangerous journey across the ocean and then across the continent and risking their lives and having their families split up, they're doing that because their only other option is to sit in a refugee camp for how many years, right? I mean, we have some clients that have been in refugee camps for 15 years or more.
From a social justice background, from a perspective like that, do you think that the U.S. government is doing enough to welcome refugees? Should we be doing more? Is the quota too low? Any thoughts on that?
I think that, in my personal opinion, just representing myself, yes, the quota is far too low. And I think we also need to talk about what happens when people come to this country, when people come here as asylum seekers and do not yet have the official government status of refugees. What we do is we put them in detention centers right now, and that's what we've seen in Texas. Texas has more detention centers than any other state in the US. And when I say detention center, I'm talking about places that closely resemble internment camps and prisons.
Sometimes people ask, okay, well, why are these people making this, why are they going there? Why don't they just go to a refugee camp or something? And it's There's already millions of people in the refugee camp. Actually, the Zatara refugee camp in Jordan, which is a Syrian refugee camp, is now one of the largest cities in Jordan because there are so many refugees that went there. And it became like its own kind of city and now is one of the largest cities in Jordan. So they have very, very few options. And raising the quotas is one of the major ways that we can start reversing all of this damage that's been done, right? And start taking that ease, taking the burden off of these European countries like Germany that are trying to take in a lot of people, but they're just completely overwhelmed.
I just want to say that I know the point of this discussion is to talk about Syrian refugees in particular, and we're talking about how that impacts Texas and Austin, but there are refugees continuously coming to our city and our state, and these incredible people are dealing with supporting them and supporting their needs every single day. So while we might not feel the impact of this particular movement of people right away, we are still feeling the movement of people from all over, and Texas is the epicenter of all of that. So doing important refugee and immigration justice work is incredibly relevant to Texas, regardless of what's going on in the world. We just happen to have a crisis right now.
And I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but part of it stems from like the U.S. seems to always be more welcoming of refugees when they come from an area where the U.S. has strategic interests. Like in the case of Vietnam, the U.S. would welcome all sorts of Vietnamese refugees because they were politically opposed to the ruling factions there. But I guess the case of Syria, is that a little bit more muddled, or?
I don't necessarily think it's that. With the reason why the U.S. has been dragging its feet so much with Syrian refugees is just, it's kind of an after effect of 9/11, as James was saying. There's a lot of paranoia about terrorism. There's a lot of extremism. There's a lot of ignorance about Islam and about Middle Eastern countries and cultures and things like that. And that's a big part of it, is that a lot of the lawmakers were saying, well, we're not going to accept so many Syrians because we don't have a good enough screening, process or something to make sure that we're not letting in terrorists and that kind of thing. But I mean, to me, that seems a little ironic because there is a pretty rigorous screening process that all refugees go through, right? It's not like we're just saying, oh, whoever, all refugees, part of the reason why it takes so long is because they have to go through these screenings and all of this whole process with the Department of Homeland Security and all of that stuff before they get here. So it's not like we're not doing anything already to try to, make sure that we're not letting in terrorists and extremists and, people who would want to start some kind of problem, which honestly there are very few of in the first place.
American myth that we only the way we decide how many visas we're going to hand out or how many refugees we're going to accept is because of our capacity to resettle them and support them. And we have seen repeatedly throughout the history of the United States that not only political concerns play a role, economic concerns play a role in who we accept, but also Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia also plays a role in who we accept. And it also plays a role in who we accept as worthy of refugee status and people who we delegate into economic migrant status and say they're less worthy of coming here. And so all that plays a role in what our quota is, rather necessarily in how we structure our refugee services and who could we actually who could we actually support as an American society. And we've seen that time and time again I was doing some reading last night with, during the 1930s, there was an incredibly low quota for Jews to enter this country because of rampant anti-Semitism in this country, not because people didn't know what was going on in Europe. Even when the information about the Nazis' death camps came out, they still didn't raise the immigration quota because rampant anti-Semitism and a desire not to have those types of people in this country. And that has happened before and many, many times again. And I also want to say that a lot of us, I think we've all been making wonderful human rights arguments and social justice arguments, which I love and motivate me, but there's also a really important economic argument for accepting refugees, both here and in Western Europe. We all have rapidly aging populations and we're not having children at the same rate, and we need these people. We need these people in our economy and in our society to be able to grow to be able to support our rapidly aging population, to pay taxes, and to also bring a richness of culture and business and everything that they're going to bring.